At the center of the most famous maze in human history was not a monster who chose to be there. It was a child nobody wanted, hidden away by the very people who created him, fed on other children because an entire kingdom couldn't think of a better solution. Ancient sources call him the Minotaur. Almost none of them bother to mention he had another name first. This is the true story of Poseidon's revenge, a queen's curse, and the boy at the center of a labyrinth who never once asked to exist. Bulls already ran in this family before any of this started. Minos' own father was Zeus, who took the shape of a magnificent white bull to carry his mother, Europa, across the sea to Crete in the first place. The same trick, the same animal, one generation earlier, dressed up as a romance instead of a curse. The story properly starts with a rigged contest and a broken deal. When King Minos of Crete needed to prove his right to the throne over his own brothers, Sarpedon and Rhadamanthus, he prayed to Poseidon for a sign, promising to sacrifice whatever the god sent back to him. Poseidon answered by driving a magnificent white bull up out of the sea itself. Minos got his throne. Then he looked at the bull, decided it was too beautiful to kill, and sacrificed a lesser animal in its place, quietly keeping the real one for his own herd. Poseidon noticed. Poseidon, covered on this channel's own Season 1, was never a god who let a broken bargain slide, and the punishment he chose wouldn't just fall on Minos. It would outlast his entire reign. There's a bitter irony buried in later tradition, too. After his death, Minos was said to become one of the 3 judges of the underworld, weighing the guilt of every soul that passed before him, a lawgiver in the afterlife who spent his own life dodging the consequences of a debt he never paid. Poseidon's revenge landed on someone who never made the deal at all. Pasiphaë herself came from a family already soaked in strange power, daughter of the sun titan Helios, sister to the witch Circe, who would later turn Odysseus's men into pigs on her own island. Whatever ran in that bloodline, it was already primed for exactly this kind of curse. Poseidon cursed Minos' wife with an overwhelming, unnatural fixation on the bull Minos had refused to sacrifice, a punishment aimed at the royal household rather than at Minos personally, which meant an innocent woman would carry the full weight of her husband's greed. Desperate and humiliated, Pasiphaë turned to Daedalus, the era's master craftsman and inventor, already living in Minos' court. He built her a hollow wooden cow, convincing enough from the outside to get her close to the animal undetected. What came from that union, 9 months later, was a child. He was born with a human body and a bull's head, though a handful of older sources describe the reverse, a bull's body with a human head, and no 2 ancient accounts fully agree on the details. He had a real name, too, Asterion, meaning roughly star or starry one, a name that almost never survives into later retellings, which prefer simply the Minotaur, Greek for Bull of Minos. Not a name, a label tying him permanently to the father who would spend the rest of his life trying to erase him. He was entirely innocent of the divine grudge that created him, and entirely unable to live a normal life from the moment he was born. Even the word labyrinth carries his family's fingerprints. It likely comes from Labyrinth, the double-headed axe carved and painted throughout Minoan Crete's real palaces, meaning the maze that would one day hold him was, quite literally, the place of the double axe, long before it was ever built. As an infant, Asterion may have looked strange, but harmless. As he grew, the ancient sources describe him getting larger, stronger, and more violent by the year. Whether from some monstrous nature baked into him at birth, or simply from years spent afraid and alone with no one willing to raise him like a son, is left deliberately unclear in almost every version. Minos wouldn't kill the child of a queen, and he wouldn't let the rest of the palace see what his wife had done. What he needed was somewhere to put a problem that kept getting bigger and angrier, with nowhere to go. Minos turned to Daedalus again, this time commissioning something almost impossible. A labyrinth beneath the palace at Knossos, engineered with so many false turns and dead ends, that its own architect reportedly struggled to find his way back out once it was finished. The Minotaur was sealed inside it, alone, in the dark, permanently separated from a world that had created him and then decided it would rather not look at him again. The labyrinth wasn't punishment for anything he'd done. It was built so nobody would ever have to explain him. Real Bronze Age ruins at Knossos, excavated in the early 1900s, reveal a palace complex so sprawling and maze-like in its own right that many historians think it's exactly where this part of the myth came from in the first place. Years later, a war with Athens ended in Minos' favor after his own son, Androgeos, was killed while visiting the city. Struck down, in most versions, either by a jealous rival or by the very bull his father once refused to sacrifice, now running loose on the Greek mainland. Minos' revenge was a horror with a schedule attached to it. Every 9 years, 14 young Athenians, 7 men and 7 women chosen by lot, would be sent into the labyrinth to be devoured. It's the cruelest detail in the entire myth, and it says far more about Minos' politics than the Minotaur's appetite. A king using his own unwanted hidden son as a weapon of state terror against a rival city, generation after generation, with no end in sight until someone finally decided to end it. By the time Theseus volunteered, this was already the 3rd cycle of tribute, meaning somewhere around 27 young Athenians had already been sent into the dark over the previous 18 years, with no hero, no rescue, and no reason to think the 28th would be any different. If this story's pulling you in, take a second now to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling them. Theseus, Prince of Athens, volunteered for the 3rd round of tribute, determined to break the cycle for good. Before his ship sailed, Ariadne, Minos' own daughter, fell for the young hero and gave him a way to survive what her own father had built. A simple ball of thread to unspool behind him as he walked into the maze so he could find his way back out again. It's easy to miss how quietly devastating that detail actually is. The solution to Minos' labyrinth came from inside his own family, handed over in direct defiance of him by the one person in Crete with the least reason to want the tribute to end. The ancient sources disagree on the exact weapon, a smuggled sword in some versions, his bare hands in others, and a handful of accounts even credit Ariadne herself with teaching Theseus the actual fighting technique before he ever set foot inside, meaning the labyrinth's own family may have armed the man sent to kill their most unwanted member. Every version agrees on the outcome, at least. Theseus found the Minotaur at the center of the labyrinth and killed him there, then followed Ariadne's thread back out through the twisting passages to the surface and to freedom. It's worth sitting with what that fight actually was, stripped of its hero framing. An armed, prepared young man from a rival city killing an isolated, half-feral creature who had been locked in the dark since infancy and never once asked to exist in the first place. Ancient Athenian potters returned to this exact moment constantly, painting Theseus and the Minotaur locked together on hundreds of surviving vases, which tells you how central this single scene was to how the Greeks understood their own most famous hero. The myth doesn't end kindly for the people who helped make it happen either. Theseus abandoned Ariadne on the island of Knossos not long after their escape, sailing on without her, though in most versions she isn't left to suffer for long. The god Dionysus finds her there and makes her his wife, a small mercy this channel's own Dionysus episode covers in full. Theseus himself pays a price too, just not the one he expected. He'd promised his father, King Aegeus, that he'd swap his ship's black sails for white ones if he survived, a signal visible from the cliffs of Athens long before the ship could dock. He forgot. Aegeus, watching from above and seeing only black sails on the horizon, assumed his son was dead and threw himself into the sea below. The sea that carries his name to this day, the Aegean. Daedalus fared just as badly. Punished by Minos for helping design both the labyrinth and Pasiphae's original disguise, he later attempted his own escape from Crete by building wings of feathers and wax for himself and his son Icarus, a flight that ended in tragedy for reasons that have nothing to do with the Minotaur at all, but everything to do with the same underlying theme. Almost everyone this story touches ends up paying for a decision they didn't personally make. The Minotaur has survived 3,000 years almost entirely as a symbol of pure menace, the beast at the center of the maze, the thing you run from. The word labyrinthine still gets used today for anything confusing and inescapable, a direct linguistic fossil of Daedalus's design. Pablo Picasso spent years returning to the Minotaur in his own work, most famously in his 1935 etching Minotauromachy, using the creature as a stand-in for something raw and half-buried inside every person. Carl Jung's own psychology borrowed him too, reaching for the Minotaur as a working image for what Jung called the shadow self, the parts of a person kept locked away, unexamined, and fed on in the dark rather than faced. Writers have kept circling back to him for the same reason. Jorge Luis Borges rewrote the myth from the Minotaur's own point of view, imagining him not as a monster waiting to kill, but as a lonely prisoner waiting, hoping for someone, anyone, to finally come find him. But the actual myth, read closely, isn't really about a monster at all. It's about inherited punishment, a child born into a divine grudge he never asked for, hidden away by a father ashamed of his own broken promise, and finally killed by a hero who never once stopped to ask who he actually was. Next in this series, the Hydra, a monster whose curse wasn't isolation but multiplication. Cut off one head, and two grow back in its place. Subscribe so you don't miss it.